On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, a partisan blame game erupts in the media after the horrific shooting of Republican Whip Steve Scalise and 4 others at a baseball practice.
Does it make it worse?
You want to know the truth.
Well, but do you rise above it and say,
no,
we all need to stay calm and focus on the work ahead of us?
You've had a series of things which send signals that tell people that it's okay to hate Trump, it's okay to think of Trump in violent terms, it's okay to consider assassinating Trump, and then suddenly we're supposed to rise above it.
Some on the hard left understand this, and that's why they support it, because political violence could lead to the dissolution of a country they despise.
It can be sort of exhausting and dispiriting in that there's immediately this sort of blaming, and there's look for who is the villain, and sort of connection from normal politics like Bernie Sanders. He volunteered for Bernie Sanders to ghastly attempted murder.
Radical leftism has always advocated violent revolution. So this guy was essentially radicalized by the left-wing media.
Do you worry that the left has gone too far in its rhetoric? If people are using rhetoric like this president is a traitor and the Republicans are treasonous and they're destroying the country and they're going to kill our people through health care and all this stuff, that might give the unhinged among you to an excuse or a target, as it were.
Yeah. The shooter was an anti-Trump liberal and Bernie Sanders volunteer who loved Rachel Maddow. But why do some pundits insist on engaging in guilt by association? As the Washington Post reports that Bob Mueller is examining obstruction of justice allegations against the president, Trump allies launch a media offensive against the special counsel.
It's a nightmare for anyone to be investigated by the FBI and the Justice Department, and it's particularly a nightmare for the President of the United States.
If President Trump really does fire Robert Mueller, he might as well just hire a skywriter to trace and smoke over the White House. I am super guilty.
And Mueller and Rod Rosenstein recuse themselves, resign immediately.
Is the reporting and the speculation getting way ahead of the facts? Megyn Kelly and NBC under fire for an interview with radio host and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, airing tonight.
They call you the most paranoid man in America. Is that true?
Absolutely not. A paranoid person will be hiding out in their house, not venturing out in public. I go out there on the street and battle Black Lives Matter, the communists, point-blank range.
Should she give a platform to a man who has called the Sandy Hook school shooting a hoax? Or is there a journalistic duty to hold him accountable? Plus, a mistrial for Bill Cosby as his wife accuses the media of blatantly vicious sensationalism. Just who is guilty here? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. There have been some calls for unity after the shooting across the river in Alexandria that left Steve Scalise in critical condition, now upgraded to serious condition. But the airwaves have been filled with angry finger-pointing by pundits and politicians. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Guy Benson, political editor at townhall.com and a Fox News contributor. Aaron McPike, White House correspondent for Independent Journal Review. And Michael Tomasky, columnist for the Daily Beast. I have a simple question for all of you. Despite these calls of unity, as we're still sort of reeling from this horrible shooting, is there too much partisan finger-pointing in the media? Guy.
Yes, definitely, especially after a horrible event like this. And I think that people want to associate speech that they don't like with acts of violence. And I think that we saw a lot of that in 2011 after Gabby Giffords, where there was no evidence. There's more evidence of that here. I still think it's wrong.
Aaron.
There's guilt on both sides. Partisanship is bad on both sides. Now, to Newt Gingrich's point, I would say that there was a lot of nasty and hateful rhetoric about President Obama for his entirety of his 8 years in office. So this happens on both sides.
Michael.
Yeah, and back in 1992, I recall Newt Gingrich trying to blame that woman in South Carolina drowning her 2 sons on the Democratic Party. But put that aside, I actually think I'll dissent a little bit. Yes, on the airwaves, sure, it's ratings. But the politicians themselves, by and large, I think have been fairly responsible this past week and haven't really fanned the flames that much.
Perhaps this past week, but, you know, if you look at what they say routinely when they get invited on cable news shows, and the more vociferous or vehement they are, the more they pop, and the better it is for the shows. But let's drill back to the dead killer here. So this Hodgson guy, and as I said, he was a Trump hater, he despised Republicans. Doesn't mean that Bernie Sanders is responsible or Rachel Maddow, whose show he watched, is responsible. But I get the sense that some conservative pundits are suggesting, well, this is kind of typical of liberals or liberal hate.
Well, I think the frustration among many on the right is that we remember Tucson very well. I covered that closely. I recall the media coverage. And immediately, the left's narrative was, Palin is responsible, the Tea Party is responsible, right-wing hate is responsible. There was not one scintilla of evidence for that. Her shooter was a schizophrenic who was not political and not remotely right-wing, and yet that big lie took root so deeply that the New York Times editorial board repeated it this week and had to correct themselves.
Yeah, I'll have more to say on that. Michael, you know, I agree with that in the sense that I covered that story as well. I wrote that day that it was ridiculous to blame Sarah Palin. But here's the thing. It kind of reinforces the point you're all making, is that both sides are perfectly willing to engage in extreme rhetoric, and particularly after a tragedy when you would think there'd be a sort of an instinct to tone it down.
Yes, they are, and it is unfortunate. And you know, at the time of the Gifford shooting, you're right. There was overreaction. There's no question about it. There was that bullseye thing which made people jump to conclusions, but they were wrong conclusions.
Okay.
You know, now I believe that. You know, there was less of this, I thought, this time. I just want to say that again. I think there was less of it this time than there usually has been.
Maybe because of the partisan angle, though, right? I think that the left and the media is much more willing to run with the narrative that right-wingers are at fault than in the other direction. We saw a few questions about it, and then the media sort of just moved on. Let's have a nice time at the congressional baseball game. That's great, but if this was a right-winger shooting Democratic Congress people, we would be having a very different conversation. I am confident of that.
In this polarized media universe, when we talk about extreme rhetoric, and you know, we're talking about not just politicians, but people who make their living spewing opinions online, on television, is this what sells? Is this what gets clicks and ratings?
I'm not even sure that I want to go down that road. I think in this case, obviously, because the shooter targeted partisan members of Congress, there is an element to that. But in so many mass shootings, there are political angles, and it's not just about partisanship, but you have shooters trying to make some kind of political statement. The thing that bothered me about some of the coverage in the days following was that a number of reporters asked about increased security for members of Congress. I think if I were the parent of a student in Newtown, or a member of that church in Charleston, or a teenager in Aurora, or a patron of the nightclub in Orlando, I would have been a little bit irritated that the media focused on security for members of Congress and not in these other cases. I think we went down a different road, and we could have done a better job in some of the questions that we're asking. Now, I know that there's always, after a number of mass shootings, on the right, at least, there's anger that the press always goes to gun control. But we do need to ask better questions about the intersection between access to guns and mental health, and we need to keep on those questions.
All right, let me go to some of the specifics as we're talking about the reactions, too. So right after the shooting, I thought that Paul Ryan in the House, and joined by Nancy Pelosi, you know, gave very unifying statements. Ryan talking about an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. But the next day, the House Minority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, talked about a case in which she had faced a stalker who made death threats, and listen to what she said.
I mean, one of the people that went to jail for threats to me, eventually, when they finally found him, because he was very resourceful in hiding, when he was being tried, his mother said he just watches too much Fox TV.
His mother said he watched Fox, therefore somehow Fox bears responsibility here?
You know, you have to ask Minority Leader Pelosi what her point was there. She also went on to say, in this whole context, that she thinks that this all got bad and really got worse starting in the 90s when Republicans decided that they were going to go down the route of personal destruction. I mean, yeah, it'd be very interesting to hear what Robert Bork might have to say about that, or Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, you can pick a lot of starting points in the past. Michael, Republican Congressman Steve King, very conservative, told a radio station in the aftermath of the shooting, "I do want to put some of this at the feet of Barack Obama. He contributed mightily to dividing us. He focused on our differences, and this is some of the fruits of that labor." So Obama's not even in office now, and gets this shot.
Yeah, well, that's kind of, to use a Trump word, sad. You know, there's way too much of this, and both sides do it at times like this, and you know, it just shouldn't happen.
Here is another example. A writer at the very liberal Huffington Post, Jesse Benn, we put that up on the screen, says in the wake of this shooting, "What's more harmful? Putting millions already on the margins more at risk via draconian policies, or shooting a racist lawmaker in the hip?" That seems to me to almost condone violence. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, again, I think we're getting caught up in some of the same patterns. another thing that I think the media could do a better job of. The Congressman Mike Bost, who is the Illinois congressman who represents the shooter, his office received 14 messages in the last 6 months from the shooter saying that they were very angry messages. But he said he never had any threats. Well, I would like to see those messages that the shooter gave to the member of Congress through his office. You know, why, if they saw these things, didn't they do a better job trying to prevent it before? He might not have had any threats. Well, he said there were no threats, but if you're getting angry messages,
but members of Congress get angry messages every single day.
I understand, but we live in a society where we're promoting, if you see something, say something. Shouldn't we do a better job looking into some of these angry messages?
I think that if it goes into threat territory, yes, but just angry venting, which is what millions of people do all the time.
But we're giving him cover by just saying
we should have people like full-time minders on Twitter.
I'm sorry.
I have one more I want to get in here, and the reason I'm doing this is I think it's important to call out people who politicize the tragedy. This is Joy Reid. She hosts a show on MSNBC. She puts up this tweet that says, Rep. Scalise was shot by a white man with a violent background and saved by a black lesbian police officer. And yet, and lists a couple of his positions, Scalise opposed gay marriage and ban on semi-automatic weapons. So the guy faced an imminent risk of death. He is still in the hospital, and I'm not saying he's immune from political criticism, but isn't this wildly inappropriate? And why bring up race?
Yes, it's disgusting, and it's a really bad look for Ms. Reid, I think, in this case. And yet, the police officer, not thinking about her sexual identity or her race, did her job with heroicism, and she saved a member of Congress, duly elected, who holds mainstream positions. That's it. And to go down the route that she was there very clearly, I think is really, really unfortunate.
Is there any hope, just briefly, that this has been such a wake-up call that there'll be a little bit of a lowering of the temperature, or is the toxic culture here to stay, and by next week everybody will be back to...
I'm afraid you know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, based on past mass shootings, you know, we all go crazy for a few days and then we move on.
It was nice to see these bipartisan expressions for a couple of days, but let's not count on anything.
All right, let us know what you think. MediaBuzz at foxnews.com. I'm sure you've got a lot of opinions about this. When we come back, the media go to DEFCON 1 over a newspaper story on the broadening of the special counsel's probe of President Trump. And later, Megyn Kelly facing a storm of protest over her interview with the controversial radio host, Alex Jones. A Washington Post story is reverberating across the media landscape. The paper saying that Special Counsel Robert Mueller will interview National Intelligence Director Dan Kurtz, NSC Chief Mike Rogers, and his deputy about conversations they're reported to have had with President Trump about Jim Comey's Russia probe. The president responding on Twitter, they made up a phony collusion with the Russian story, found zero proof, so now they go for obstruction of justice on the phony story. Nice. He also said the greatest witch hunt in American history is being led by some very bad and conflicted people. So, Guy Benson, this Washington Post story enabled everyone in the media to say, wow, the president is under criminal investigation, which had not been true or certainly not confirmed before. But isn't that what Bob Mueller was hired to do, to look at all these allegations?
Yes, and this is an important story. But since we're talking about the media, I would want to point out, and this struck me this week, the swiftness with which the media pivoted back to the top story being Russia.
Yes.
While you had a member of Republican leadership in critical condition fighting for his life after an act of political terrorism, it was like 2 days, and then back to Russia as the top story. I really question that news judgment.
I'm going to disagree with you. It wasn't 2 days. It was right away. The very night of the shooting, MSNBC on its primetime shows, you know, put it on some shows near the top, even as the breaking news was, you know, all these.
And I'm not saying they shouldn't have covered it. It is an important story, but it was not the top story.
And I'm not saying that any of this shouldn't be covered, and it is an important story with the president under investigation, but wasn't it inevitable that Mueller would talk to top intel officials and others about the Trump conversations? Is this just make it official? In other words, is the volume too high here?
Look, I think it's very clear that Donald Trump himself made it an even bigger story by going on to Twitter. Now, I'm not one who actually thinks he should stop tweeting. He obviously is speaking his mind. He's speaking directly to the people. He's giving us a lot of material every single day. But Donald Trump made this a bigger story.
Let's talk for a moment, Michael, about what it seems to be a somewhat orchestrated counterattack against Robert Mueller by the president's allies. And it began with a couple of interviews over the past week. Let's take a look.
Will the president promise not to interfere, not attempt at any time to order the Deputy Attorney General to fire Robert Mueller?
Look, the president of the United States, as we all know, it's a unitary executive.
Well, I think he's considering
perhaps terminating the special counsel. I think he's weighing that option.
That was Christopher Ruddy, the CEO of Newsmax and a friend of the president, and this started lots of talk about, well, is the president going to fire Bob Mueller? But a lot of it was just chatter.
Well, the basis of it originally was that it seemed that Trump himself was not under investigation. That was the gist, for example, of Ann Coulter's tweet that said, "Why don't we drop this investigation? And why don't we get rid of Mueller?"
Right.
But then the Washington Post story confirmed that Trump apparently is under investigation, so that justification was cut out.
Right. Is it fair for people sympathetic to the president to say, well, Mueller may be a great former FBI director and a very upstanding prosecutor, but he's a longtime associate or friend of Comey, who's sort of the chief witness here, and therefore he can't really conduct this investigation?
It's a fair thing to say. I mean, then public opinion will decide, and people will decide, and Congress will decide, and everybody who gets to determine these things will decide. But yeah, they can say whatever they want to say, sure.
I'm not a big defender all the time, reflexively, of the president. One thing that I do think that the media could do a better job of in this entire conversation is there are many Americans, according to polling, that believe that this obstruction charge has to do with the Russia probe itself, that the president was trying to shut down or impede the Russia investigation. Based on James Comey's testimony, that is not the case. This was related to a tertiary investigation into Michael Flynn and his actions. That is an important distinction.
Right. We've had presidents attack special prosecutors before, Bill Clinton versus Ken Starr famously in the Monica Lewinsky case. But
Not a big defender all the time, reflexively, of the president. One thing that I do think that the media could do a better job of in this entire conversation is there are many Americans, according to polling, that believe that this obstruction charge has to do with the Russia probe itself, that the president was trying to shut down or impede the Russia investigation. Based on James Comey's testimony, that is not the case. This was related to a tertiary investigation into Michael Flynn and his actions. That is an important...
Let's take a more personal look at covering the tragic shooting at a Virginia baseball field with Susan Faricio, chief congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. So talk about the day of the shooting, and was it hard for you personally to cover this story? Because you know Steve Scalise and these other lawmakers, and you see them regularly.
We see them, and we see the agents who follow the lawmakers around. We actually walk along with them in these big scrums of reporters, so we get pretty close to them. They hang out in our galleries when there's nothing else going on and they have time to take a break. We know them by their first names. We stand in the hallways with, I mean, these are people we work with every single day.
Were you upset? Is it hard to sort of separate your emotions when, you know, you didn't know that any of these people were going to die?
No, it's shocking. It was shocking for all the reporters. What was different about this, you know, if you compare it to the 2011 tragic shooting in Tucson with Gabby Giffords, who I sat with at a congressional dinner just weeks earlier.
Right.
That was very emotional. But here you had the lawmakers returning to the Capitol right from the baseball field. And there we all were with our cameras and our microphones. It was really emotional and dramatic for everybody. It was just, we were all just stunned listening to them recount exactly what happened. And it was just...
Yeah, I listened to Rand Paul and others, and everybody was sort of in a state of shock, understandably, because, you know, playing baseball on a nice morning in Virginia. How did you get your information in those first hours when everything was sort of a blur and we didn't know wasn't even clear how many people had been shot, who the shooter was, etc.?
We really got it straight from the lawmakers, which is, again, what made this so fascinating to cover, because confusion amongst all of us initially. When the lawmakers came in from the field, we got a clearer picture, first-hand accounts. I mean, you don't often get that right away.
You're waiting for the police press conference where somebody else has interviewed them.
Interpreted what happened.
Right.
We heard it straight from them. And the sense, the overwhelming sense from them when they came in, and which is what it made it so incredibly raw, was that they felt as though they had just dodged death because they were sitting on a field. You know, they talked about if Hodgkinson had turned a corner into the dugout, then many more of them would have been shot because they were cornered. You know, stories like that, very compelling.
Except for the very brave Capitol Police officers who were there because Steve Scalise is a member of the leadership. And I remember listening to one of the lawmakers say, you know, the guy had come up to him and say, is this a Republican or a Democratic baseball practice? So a couple of nights later, they carried on with the charity baseball game for which they've been practicing. 25,000 people showed up in Nationals Park. How much have you detected a tone from these members that they want to lower the temperature, and how long do you think that will last, or is this just an interlude?
I think particularly for the people who were there on the field and had the bullets coming at them, they really feel the urge, the need to lower the tone, create a more civil tone in Congress. You know, people who weren't there, the Democrats who are in the minority, you know, they don't have any legislative control. They're always going to be the ones right now to be the most vocal, the most critical. I know that that's not going to change because they're too far apart politically on what they want to accomplish.
Right. Well, have the political fights, but maybe in a slightly more civil way.
I'm not sure about that. I haven't heard that immediately.
All right. Well, you would know.
Yeah.
Susan Fruscio, thanks very much for that first-hand account. Coming up, Rich Lowry on the media fallout from the shooting of Steve Scalise and the coverage of the widening investigation of President Trump. And later, Bill Cosby gets a mistrial, and his wife eviscerates the media. Was he convicted by the press? Let's take a deeper dive now in these emotional questions of media coverage, partisan rhetoric, and the shooting at a Virginia baseball field. Joining us now from New York is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review and a Fox News contributor. Rich, some conservative voices in the media and politics are saying that because the shooter hated Republicans, targeted Republicans, that the violence is somehow linked to harsh or hateful liberal rhetoric. Does that go too far?
Yeah, I don't really buy that. I don't like it when the left does that to conservatives when they're shootings, and I don't think we should do it to them. There's nothing that Bernie Sanders has said that would possibly lead any rational person to go and try to massacre Republican congressmen. So, look, I think everyone should be civil. Just because being civil is a good in its own right, we should always treat people with respect and recognize every individual has decency. We're all Americans. But the idea that any political rhetoric beyond saying go and shoot these people incites violence, I really reject.
I totally agree with you. And the whole guilt by association efforts by more extreme partisans on both sides just drives me crazy, especially at a time of tragedy. But why do you think that we have reached a tone now where so many political partisans say such inflammatory things, not necessarily advocating violence, of course, but do you think the media culture, in part, rewards that?
Well, in part, you know, we have a small d democratic media now where pretty much anyone can have a soapbox, so that means there are fewer guardrails than there ever been before. But also with a little perspective, you know, you look back just recent history. The Democrats considered George W. Bush a budding tyrant. The Republicans considered Barack Obama a budding tyrant. Democrats now consider Donald Trump a budding tyrant. And this is nothing new. This goes back literally to the beginning of our history, where both Jefferson and Hamilton considered each other dangerous and potential budding tyrants. So this is just kind of the idiom of American politics. I think it's part of having a robust and open constant argument about how we should run our country, and I don't think any of that necessarily leads anyone to go out and shoot people. It just doesn't.
Right. I agree with you again there, but the idea that these are all potential tyrants seems to me to sort of fall into the media/political warfare techniques of demonizing the opponents. They're not just people who are totally wrong-headed policies. You don't like them personally, but they are evil. They are a threat to democracy. And it would be nice if we could tone that down. But as you say, in the age of Twitter, anybody can say that, and then it gets picked up, and cable news does segments about it and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I have to say how one thing that's really bothered me about the coverage, and it's hard to prove, but I think it's fairly obvious. If this had been a Trump supporter who had committed such an act of violence, there wouldn't have been anything Donald Trump could have said that would have convinced anyone in the media that he wasn't responsible, and every Republican in the country would have to answer for it. Now, there's been a lot of conversation and discussion driven by this perpetrator's political views, but it hasn't been as thermonuclear as if he had been someone on the right side of the political spectrum. And then also you still have folks in the media attached to this ridiculous narrative that somehow the shooting of Gabby Giffords, perpetrated by a young man who's a paranoid schizophrenic, literally out of his mind, had something to do with Sarah Palin or political rhetoric on the right.
Absurd at the time, equally absurd looking back 6 years later. Let's switch to the special counsel's investigation. So Washington Post reports this week that Bob Mueller is looking at Jared Kushner's business dealings. Big breaking news. Everybody picks it up. Well, wouldn't any competent prosecutor be looking at a real estate guy who has had some contacts with the Russians? In other words, is this a, a routine part of an investigation. Jared Kushner's lawyer says it's standard practice that somehow, makes these screaming headlines.
I think it's more alarming than that, and I think it's a bad sign that Mueller's investigation is spreading well beyond what should be its writ, which is basically finding out if the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians. But we're sort of far beyond that, even just a month into his appointment, and I kind of believe, I can't prove it, but I believe that people will end up being indicted for financial wrongdoing that has almost zero connection to what was supposed to be the purpose of this investigation.
Right. I mean, I would say the same thing, all the headlines about Mike Pence has hired a lawyer. Well, any top official who's going to have to talk to the FBI is going to hire an attorney, and so each thing, I think, is getting, they're legitimate stories, but the volume is cranked up to 11. On your point, special prosecutors often expand their mandate, but once James Comey made those allegations at a Senate hearing, doesn't Mueller, in order to be credible, if he decides to bring no charges against anybody, have to look into some of these things? And is that the way it's being portrayed by the press?
Yeah, it's just always tempting for these special counsels who have nothing else to do. This is all they focus on, to go until they find something, even if there's nothing on the original charge. And a big problem I have with the media coverage is focused so much on the so-called smoke. But when there's a story that creates a lot of smoke, like this New York Times story a couple months ago about Trump campaign officials allegedly having routine communications with Russian officials and Russian intelligence, you had James Comey saying that story is flat out false. All the outlets that repeated that in print and on cable TV, none of them go back and say, oh, we're very sorry we ever said this or repeated the story, and some smoke just left the room. We want everyone in America to know. They never do that.
Right. My only caveat there is that Comey didn't say precisely what was false. I think that would have been helpful. But Rich Lowry, thanks for a great conversation on this Sunday. Ahead, why the New York Times is still funding that appalling Julius Caesar production, the one in which the Trump character gets stabbed to death. But next on MediaBuzz, a strange twist as Alex Jones tries to preempt Megyn Kelly's interview tonight by releasing their private phone calls. Dan Abrams is on deck. NBC has come under sharp pressure to cancel a segment on tonight's magazine show in which Megyn Kelly interviewed radio host Alex Jones, pressing him on why he has called the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting a hoax. Family members of those killed at the Connecticut school have harshly criticized her for giving Jones a platform. One major advertiser has bailed out, but Megyn, my former Fox News colleague, has strongly defended the segment as shining a needed light on a popular and controversial media figure.
Sandy Hook.
Well, Sandy Hook's complex because I've had debates where we've devil's advocates said the whole story's true, and then I've had debates where I've said that none of it's true.
When you say parents faked their children's death, people get very angry.
Yeah, well, I know, but they don't get angry about the $500,000 dead Iraqis from the sanctions, or they don't get angry about all the illegals.
That's a dodge.
No, it's not a dodge. I looked at all the angles of Newtown, and I made my statements long before the media even picked up on it.
I spoke earlier with Dan Abrams, the founder of Mediaite and ABC's chief legal analyst from New York. Dan Abrams, welcome.
Hi, Howie.
So here's the argument, that Alex Jones is a conspiracy theorist who's called 9/11 an inside job, who had to apologize for the Pizzagate child sex trafficking fabrication, and who's called the Sandy Hook Elementary shootings a hoax. Why should NBC and Megyn Kelly give him a big platform?
Because he already has a platform, and because the President of the United States has given him a platform. And as a result, he is a significant player. You may dislike him, and I think a lot of people do, and rightly so. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, as a journalist, want to question him and ask tough questions. And the thing that I'm kind of amazed about is everyone's judging the Megyn Kelly interview before they've seen the interview. Have we seen a clip? Sure. But we haven't actually seen what they're putting on the air, and yet everyone's going bananas about this from both sides.
I think that's a fair point, and we should reserve judgment. But Alex Jones, now with a bizarre twist on Friday, kind of taking control a little bit of the narrative by releasing some of the phone calls that he had with Megyn Kelly when she was trying to book him for this interview. Let's take a listen.
All I can do is give you my word and tell you, if there's one thing about me, I do what I say I'm going to do, and I don't double-cross. It's not going to be some gotcha hit piece. I promise you that.
I knew it was a fraud. I knew it was a lie. God, she was like, I want to get steaks with you. I'm obsessed with you.
So, Dan, whatever the value of the interview itself, this thing has become a full-blown spectacle. Hasn't NBC lost control of the narrative here?
Well, look, they should have expected this. I mean, when you're interviewing Alex Jones, you should expect that every call you do with him, anything you say with him, he's going to be recording. So I don't think this should come as a surprise. And I have to say that upon listening to what he released of Megyn Kelly's comments, I think she came across fine, meaning, you know, we all know how the booking process works, right? And people end up trying to sweet talk people, convince them to come on, etc. And a lot of people say some pretty embarrassing stuff. I didn't hear that from Megyn Kelly.
Right.
So I think that's, in that sense, it's kind of a win for her.
All right, well, sweet-talking guess is not a journalistic felony, but, you know, what's more serious and what I find heartbreaking is, you know, the families of the Sandy Hook victims saying that Alex Jones has made their life a living hell, that he's caused them pain, that he's accused them of being actors, some now threatening to sue NBC. And just for example, the family of Victoria Soto, teacher killed at the school, writes, this is an incessant need for ratings at the cost of the emotional well-being of our family is disgusting and disappointing. And so you have to stop and ask, given that impact on that community in Connecticut, is this really worth doing?
Yeah, look, I get it. I hear them. And as someone who's covered legal stories and crime stories for most of my career, I know how those families feel. And yet I've interviewed murderers for network television and hasn't had this kind of response. That doesn't necessarily make it right, but it means that for some reason we're treating the Alex Jones interview as a more sort of journalistic minefield than when we interview murderers or suspected murderers. And that's the part that I don't quite get from a journalistic point of view.
You make a good point. There's a long tradition here, you know, Saddam Hussein or O.J. Simpson or Charles Manson.
I mean,
all getting, and that's always controversial. But do you think it's something about Megyn, about NBC, about the passionate following that Alex Jones has that has made this whole thing radioactive?
Well, look, I think Alex Jones is helping to stoke the fire here, right?
Well, he doesn't want NBC to air the interview, or so he says.
Oh, come on, you really believe that? I mean, I think that Alex Jones just wants to get more attention for this. I think he's using every piece of the cow that he can, and part of that involves him demanding that NBC not air the interview. I mean, he hasn't seen the interview. What is he talking about? I mean, this notion, I mean, she even makes clear in the pre-interview she does with him, yeah, I'm going to have to ask you the tough questions. He's making it seem like he had no idea that there would be hard questions. Look, this is great. The only true winner from this is Alex Jones. No matter what the interview is, no matter what part they air, Megyn Kelly is getting beaten up from both sides on this. Alex Jones supporters saying, oh, look how unfair you are already. People on the left saying, how can you give Alex Jones any time? And then, of course, most importantly, as you point out, those families, which I'm sure is the hardest part for someone like Megyn Kelly to hear.
Absolutely. So we have a little bit of time left. You know, Megyn Kelly makes the point that President Trump went on Alex Jones's radio show, called him after the election. That makes Jones more newsworthy. But ultimately, is this about NBC and Megyn confronting Alex Jones about alleged falsehoods, or is it also about generating buzz and ratings for her new NBC magazine show?
Well, every magazine show is about both those things. I mean, the notion that NBC's magazine show can't focus on ratings. Of course they're focused on ratings. Of course they did this in part because they thought Alex Jones would be a good ratings-worthy interview. But I think that it's also a good interview for them to do, depending on how, look, if she asks softball questions, criticize her. If they air an interview where she's letting him get away with some of this nonsense, then let's criticize her. But until we see that interview, until we see what she's done, I just think that the criticism here has been incredibly unfair before you see it.
Well, we'll all get to weigh in Monday morning. Dan Abrams, great to see you.
Good to see you, Howie.
NBC News says that while Alex Jones is trying to distract from and even block the segment, the network wants to offer context and insight into a controversial and polarizing figure. But the NBC station in Connecticut, where the school shooting took place, not airing the interview tonight. After the break, many in the media stunned that Bill Cosby wasn't convicted yesterday in his sexual assault trial. But should they really be surprised?